On the first day of September in 1858, a joint French and Spanish expeditionary force under the command of Admiral Charles Rigaud de Junouilly opened fire on the harbor defenses of Toulon, known today as Da Nang. The smoke from the cannons drifted across the water as the bombardment signaled the beginning of what would become known as the Cochin-China campaign. By the following day, the Allied force had stormed the coastal forts and occupied the town itself, establishing the first sustained Western military foothold in Nguyen, Vietnam during this turbulent era. Napoleon III had authorized this punitive expedition in late 1857, linking it publicly to the protection of Catholic missionaries who had faced persecution under Emperor Tu-Duc. Yet beneath these stated justifications lay broader imperial ambitions in Asia, a desire to secure French influence in a region increasingly contested by European powers. The initial French plan envisioned Touraine as a permanent naval base from which pressure could be exerted upon the imperial court at Hue. From such a position, the French hoped to extract concessions and establish a lasting presence in the kingdom. The expeditionary force was considerable for its time. Around 14 warships and roughly 2,500 troops comprised the Allied contingent, including both French Marines and Spanish soldiers drawn from garrisons in the Philippines. Yet despite these numbers and the firepower they commanded, the campaign did not unfold as its architects had anticipated. Contrary to French expectations, the local Vietnamese Christians around Toulon did not stage a mass uprising in support of the invading forces. This absence of popular support severely limited the expedition's political leverage and left the Allied troops isolated in hostile territory. The Nguyen court responded swiftly. Emperor Tu-Duc entrusted defense of the Touraine region to the experienced commander Nguyen Tri Phuong, who organized field fortifications and siege lines around the Franco-Spanish position. Rather than offering a decisive, open battle that might favor European firepower, Vietnamese forces shifted to a strategy of encirclement, content to let time, disease, and supply difficulties accomplish what direct assault could not. And so the months passed. Disease spread through the French and Spanish camps, supply difficulties mounted. The unexpectedly effective Vietnamese siege made any inland advance from Toulon impracticable throughout 1859. The vision of marching on Hue from this coastal foothold began to seem increasingly unrealistic. By late 1858 and into early 1859, Admiral Rigaud de Junouilly began reconsidering his entire strategy. Toulon, it seemed clear, would not serve as the lever to pry open Vietnam. He examined alternatives, including operations in Tonkin to the north or Cochin-China to the south. Tonkin operations were judged to depend upon the unlikely prospect of a large Christian uprising, a gamble that Touraine had already proven false. And so the admiral proposed a different target altogether. He turned his attention to Saigon. Saigon, located in Gia Dinh province in the far south, held strategic importance as a major rice-producing and provisioning center for Nguyen forces defending the southern regions. Control of Saigon would strike at the economic foundations of Vietnamese resistance. In early February of 1859, Rigaud de Junouilly sailed south from Touraine with the bulk of his squadron, leaving behind a reduced garrison under Capitaine de Vaisseau Thoyon to hold the original position. On the 17th of February, the Franco-Spanish flotilla broke through river defenses along the Saigon River. Forts and stockades fell one after another as the Allied vessels advanced upstream. French Marine infantry stormed the citadel of Saigon, while Filipino troops under Spanish command repelled Nguyen counterattacks. The city had fallen, but holding it would prove another matter entirely. The Allies found themselves lacking sufficient manpower to defend the immense Saigon citadel. In a decision that revealed both their vulnerability and their ruthlessness, they demolished the fortress and burned nearby rice granaries on the 8th of March, 1859, denying these supplies to imperial forces. It was a scorched earth measure born of necessity rather than strength. Following this initial capture, Rigaud de Genouilly returned to Tourane in April with most of his forces to reinforce the hard-pressed garrison there. Command of the reduced Saigon garrison, numbering only about 1,000 Franco-Spanish troops, passed to Capitaine de Frégate Bernard Jauregui-Berry. These men now found themselves isolated in a hostile land, holding a ruined city surrounded by enemies. Vietnamese imperial forces responded to the fall of Saigon by imposing a siege that would last 2 years, significantly constraining Allied movements. Throughout 1859 and 1860, the Hoo court balanced military resistance with growing concern over the loss of southern rice supplies, which threatened the provisioning of imperial armies. French command eventually recognized that maintaining both Tourane and Saigon was impossible with available resources. In March of 1860, French forces evacuated Tourane entirely, ending an 18-month occupation. The fall of Tourane back into Nguyen hands shifted the theater of operations more decisively to Saigon and Cochin China. The turning point came when the French Navy obtained substantial reinforcements following the conclusion of European commitments related to the Second Opium War in China. Admiral Leonard Charner arrived to command forces in early 1861 and led operations to break the Vietnamese siege lines around Saigon. In the early months of that year, French and Spanish troops under Charner won a key victory at the Battle of Quy Hoa near Saigon, finally regaining operational freedom in the region. Following Quy Hoa, Allied forces could operate more freely throughout the Mekong Delta, turning from their long defensive posture in Saigon to an offensive seizure of nearby territories. In April of 1861, a French column under Capitaine de Vaisseau, Antoine Louis Le Courrier du Quillot, advanced along the Bao Dinh Ha Creek, capturing forts along the route and taking My Tho southwest of Saigon. This extended Allied control deeper into the eastern Mekong Delta and threatened Nguyen authority in Dinh Duong province. The French had learned to exploit the waterways. A combination of naval gunboats and marine infantry allowed them to use the river networks of Cochin China to bypass Vietnamese defensive lines. By late 1861 and early 1862, Admiral Louis Adolphe Bernard, who had succeeded Charner, concentrated on consolidating French positions in the provinces surrounding Saigon. In late March of 1862, French forces captured the fortress of Vinh Long in a punitive move against guerrilla attacks attributed to local authorities. The fall of Vinh Long weakened Nguyen capacity to coordinate resistance in the eastern delta and increased pressure on the Hue court to negotiate. Coastal and riverine operations progressively detached the provinces of Bien Hoa, Gia Dinh, and Dinh Duong from effective imperial control. Under mounting military and economic pressure, Emperor Tuc Duc authorized envoys to negotiate with the Franco-Spanish commanders, seeking to preserve the remainder of his realm. On the 5th of June, 1862, Minister Phan Thanh Gian signed the Treaty of Saigon on behalf of Vietnam with Admiral Bernard for France and Colonel Carlos Palanca Gutierrez for Spain. The treaty ceded to France the provinces of Bien Hoa, Gia Dinh, and Dinh Duong, along with the island of Pulo Condor, establishing formal French sovereignty in those territories. Vietnam was also required to legalize the free practice of Catholicism, open certain ports including Tourane to foreign trade, and pay a substantial indemnity to France and Spain over 10 years. By accepting these terms, the Huy court effectively acknowledged a permanent French presence in southern Vietnam, while hoping to avoid further incursions into the remaining provinces. The treaty provoked discontent among Vietnamese officials and local leaders who viewed the cession of 3 provinces as an unacceptable loss of territory and prestige. In 1863, the treaty was confirmed by an agreement signed at Huer. The following year, the 3 ceded southern provinces were formally organized by France into the colony of Cochinchina, administratively distinct from the rest of Vietnam. Yet resistance did not simply fade away. Figures such as Trung Dinh continued armed opposition in parts of Cochinchina, often acting without US instructions. French authorities expressed concern that their new colony lacked defensible frontiers, noting that neighboring southwestern provinces still under Huy could harbor insurgents. Governor Pierre de la Grandière argued that annexation of the remaining southwestern provinces was necessary for security. Between 1866 and 1867, French diplomacy pressed Emperor Tu Duc to transfer Vinh Long, Cho Duc, and Ha Tien. Phan Thanh Gian, then governor of Vinh Long, offered little military resistance and ultimately resigned. Between the 20th and 24th of June 1867, French troops occupied all 3 southwestern provinces with minimal opposition. With this final occupation, France completed its conquest of the Mekong Delta. All of Cochinchina now lay under direct colonial control. What had started as a punitive expedition had become permanent occupation. After France completed the occupation of Vinh Long, Cho Duc, and Ha Tien in June of 1867, the entire Mekong Delta was placed under a unified French colonial regime distinct from the Nguyen imperial state. The South had been severed from the rest of Vietnam, and a new order began to take shape across the conquered provinces. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, Cochinchina remained under what became known as the rule of the admirals, in which naval officers exercised combined civil and military authority over the colony. These men governed by decree, their word carrying the force of law in a land still adjusting to foreign domination. In 1871, the southern Vietnamese territories, ceded and occupied by France, were formally organized as the colony of Cochinchina, with Admiral Marie-Jules Dupré named as its first governor. Under the admiral governors, Cochinchina was administered through decrees issued by the governor, who reported directly to the French Ministry of the Navy and Colonies in Paris. Provincial administration in early colonial Cochinchina relied on French-appointed provincial chiefs who replaced Nguyen mandarins as the main local authorities. Vietnamese officials who remained were generally retained only in subordinate or advisory roles, marking a profound shift from the old imperial bureaucratic hierarchy to direct colonial rule. The transition to civilian governance came in 1879, when Charles Lemire de Villers was appointed as the first civilian governor of Cochinchina, ending the exclusive era of admiral governors. Under Lemire de Villers, the colonial government began to formalize a civil administration, including a colonial council to advise the governor on budgets and regulations. This council was composed mainly of French officials and European settlers, giving local colonists a consultative voice in governance while keeping ultimate authority firmly in French hands. Alongside the colonial council, provincial councils were created to discuss taxation, public works, and local regulations. Cochinchina differed fundamentally from Annam and Tonkin in that it was legally an integral French colony, not merely a protectorate. This status meant that Cochinchina was subject to more direct French legislative control and that its residents lived under a different legal framework than their compatriots in the center and north. As a French colony, Cochinchina even elected a deputy to the National Assembly in Paris, providing limited parliamentary representation for French residents in the territory. The judicial system was reorganized into separate jurisdictions for Europeans and for the indigenous population, reflecting a dual legal structure that would persist for decades. French civil and commercial law was applied to Europeans and foreign settlers through colonial courts, while adapted versions of Nguyen customary law and royal edicts continued for many Vietnamese cases. Over time, French legal codes increasingly extended into areas of land, contract, and criminal law for Vietnamese residents, narrowing the scope of purely indigenous jurisdiction. The governor of Cochinchina held considerable power, including the authority to issue administrative orders that could define land rights, taxation rules, and municipal regulations without local legislative approval. Immediately after consolidating control, the colonial administration used taxation as a primary instrument for financing the state and reshaping the local economy. Taxes imposed in Cochinchina included personal head taxes, land taxes, labor obligations, customs duties, and indirect taxes on salt, alcohol, and opium. Several of these had precedence under the Nguyen dynasty, but the colonial government restructured and expanded them to increase revenue. Tax revenues were allocated to support the administrative apparatus, pay colonial officials, and fund infrastructure such as roads, canals, and port facilities. Land tax became a central pillar of the fiscal system, tying state income directly to the expansion and commercialization of rice agriculture. The colonial regime introduced detailed cadastral surveys to register land holdings, which facilitated tax collection and the granting of concessions to large owners. In the countryside, village communities remained responsible for collecting many taxes from individual households and remitting them to the colonial treasury. French policy encouraged the concentration of land in large estates, particularly in fertile delta zones, by granting extensive concessions to investors and settlers. The colonial state expropriated large tracts of land that it classified as vacant or state domain and then transferred them to concessionaires for agricultural development. Many of these concessions in Cochinchina were devoted to rice cultivation, reinforcing the region's emerging role as a major rice exporting area within French Indochina. Early large-scale plantation investment focused on rice and later diversified into crops such as rubber, though rubber expansion would accelerate most dramatically after 1900. Lower tax rates on cultivated land relative to other regions of Indochina encouraged capital investment in Cochinchina's estates in the late 19th century. Yet this transformation of land tenure weakened many traditional communal landholding patterns, increasing the number of land-poor peasants who became reliant on working large estates owned by others. At the heart of this new colonial world stood Saigon, designated the capital of French Cochinchina. The city became the main seat of the governor, central administration, and high courts. During the late 19th century, Saigon underwent systematic urban planning, with wide, straight boulevards modeled on European city design, replacing the older Vietnamese settlement patterns. New European-style neighborhoods were constructed in central Saigon, featuring masonry houses, administrative buildings, and commercial establishments that announced French permanence and power. French authorities built the Notre-Dame Palace in the 1860s and 1870s as the official residence of the governor of Cochinchina. Saigon's built environment was further marked by the construction of the Notre Dame Cathedral in the 1870s, symbolizing the presence of the French Catholic Church. Other prominent landmarks from this era included the Bain Tyne Market, Hotel Continental, and Botanical Garden, which served commercial, social, and scientific functions. The colonial government invested heavily in improving Saigon's port facilities to handle increasing volumes of rice and other exports through the Saigon River. Expansion of wharves, warehouses, and navigation infrastructure supported the city's role as the main commercial gateway of Cochinchina. New roads and canals linked Saigon with the Mekong Delta, facilitating the flow of agricultural products from estates to the port. The urban population grew steadily as migrants arrived seeking work in construction, trade, and services. Saigon's urban structure displayed a marked spatial separation between a European core with planned streets and modern services and predominantly Vietnamese suburbs on the periphery. This division in physical space reflected and reinforced the social hierarchies of colonial rule. In 1887, Cochinchina became a founding component of the Union of French Indochina, integrating its administration with that of Annam, Tonkin, Cambodia, and later Laos. Within this larger federation, Cochinchina retained its status as a directly ruled colony, while Annam and Tonkin were officially protectorates with their own nominal royal governments. The Governor-General of Indochina, based in Hanoi, exercised overarching authority after 1887, but the governor of Cochinchina continued to manage day-to-day affairs in the south. Fiscal policy was coordinated with broader Indochinese budgets, yet Cochinchina remained one of the most fiscally robust territories due to its agricultural exports. By the 1890s, Saigon functioned as the economic capital of French Indochina, even though Hanoi served as the political center of the Union. Municipal government in Saigon developed gradually, with a municipal council introduced to oversee urban services such as sanitation, street maintenance, and local regulations. Public works during the late 19th century included street lighting, drainage improvements, and the introduction of modern utilities in central districts. By the end of the 19th century, Saigon's combination of administrative institutions, port infrastructure, and planned urban space reflected its role as the hub of the colony of Cochinchina. The city had been transformed from a Vietnamese provincial center into a showpiece of French colonial ambition. The South had been thoroughly incorporated into the French colonial system. What had once been provinces of the Nguyen Empire now served as the foundation for a new kind of society, one shaped by foreign law, foreign capital, and foreign ambition. Vietnamese farmers who had once paid taxes to the emperor at Hue now paid them to French collectors. Vietnamese litigants who had once sought justice from mandarins now appeared before colonial courts. The loss of the South was complete. Cochinchina had become something new, neither wholly Vietnamese nor wholly French, but a colonial creation that would shape the lives of millions for generations to come. And even as the French consolidated their hold on the South, their eyes had already turned northward, toward the protectorates of Annam and Tonkin, where the Nguyen court still maintained a shadow of sovereignty under increasingly restrictive terms. In August of 1883, the First Treaty of Hue was signed, establishing a French protectorate over Vietnam. Under this agreement, often called the Harmon Treaty, the country was divided into two distinct regions under French protection, Annam in the center and Tonkin in the north. The Nguyen dynasty, which had ruled Vietnam for decades, would remain on the throne, but its sovereignty had been fundamentally compromised. The 1883 treaty required the Nguyen court to recognize French colonial rule in Cochinchina, which had already been conquered, and to accept French protection over both Annam and Tonkin. Vietnam agreed to withdraw its remaining troops from Tonkin, clearing the way for French military and administrative occupation. The Harman Treaty provided France with broad rights to station troops throughout the Protectorate territories and to control all foreign relations for Annam and Tonkin while nominally preserving the Hui monarchy. Because many provisions of the 1883 treaty were considered excessively harsh and were never fully ratified in France, a second agreement was later negotiated. On the 6th of June, 1884, the Second Treaty of Hu, known as the Patent-Notre Treaty, replaced and softened the earlier Harmond Agreement while confirming the French protectorates over Annam and Tonkin. This new treaty restated French control of external relations and defense while granting the Hui court limited authority over internal administration. The Patent-Notre Treaty allowed France to station residents in most towns of Annam and Tonkin, creating the legal basis for what would become known as the residency system. Both treaties affirmed that France would guarantee the territorial integrity of the Annamese kingdom while assuming responsibility for suppressing internal uprisings. In treaty language, the French commitment to protect the Nguyen monarch against external aggression and internal rebellion justified stationing French troops across both protectorates. After the treaties, Annam and Tonkin were formally protectorates rather than colonies. This distinction meant that the Nguyen monarchy survived, but under French supervision so close that independence became largely symbolic. In 1887, Annam and Tonkin were incorporated into the Union of French Indochina alongside Cochin China and Cambodia, placing them under the authority of a governor-general based in Hanoi. Unlike Cochin China, which was a directly ruled colony, Annam and Tonkin officially remained sovereign states under the Nguyen dynasty, though constrained by treaty. The French created the post of resident general in Annam Tonkin soon after the treaties, later dividing it into separate resident superior positions for each protectorate. The resident superior of Annam, based at Hu, acted as the chief French authority in that protectorate and served as intermediary between the Hui court and the governor-general of Indochina. The resident superior of Tonkin, based in Hanoi, similarly directed French policy in northern Vietnam and oversaw military and civil administration there. Both residents superior reported to the governor-general, who coordinated colonial policy across all territories in the Union. A commonly cited summary of the protectorate structure captured the reality behind the formal arrangements. The king reigns, but the resident superior rules. This phrase highlighted the profound imbalance between Hu's formal status and actual French power. In Annam, the resident superior presided over a protectorate council composed of French service chiefs and selected Vietnamese members, advising on budgets and local public works. Vietnamese provincial governors continued to exist, appointed by the Hui court, but they operated under the close supervision of French residents. Each province in Annam and Tonkin had a French resident or administrateur who monitored local mandarins and influenced decisions on taxation and justice. The resident superior retained the power to veto or annul appointments deemed unsuitable, ensuring that Vietnamese officials understood where real authority lay. In Tonkin, French residency posts formed a dense network extending from Hanoi into provincial centers and strategic districts. The residency system allowed French authorities to intervene in local governance while maintaining the appearance of continuity in the Nguyen bureaucratic hierarchy. In legal terms, courts in Annam and Tonkin were divided between French tribunals and indigenous tribunals, with jurisdiction determined partly by ethnicity and subject matter. In Toran, a French tribunal exercised exclusive jurisdiction, though it applied Vietnamese law to cases involving Vietnamese litigants. Outside special zones, indigenous tribunals staffed by mandarins continued, applying a mixture of Nguyen codes and customary law, all subject to French oversight. French criminal and commercial law were gradually extended, especially in Tonkin, where French control was more direct than in Annam. Compared with Cochinchina's fully colonial legal regime, Annam and Tonkin retained more formal space for Vietnamese law, though this space narrowed over time. Immediately after the 1883 treaty, French military forces in Tonkin engaged in what became known as the Tonkin Campaign. They fought Vietnamese troops, Liu Yongfu's Black Flag Army, a Chinese irregular force that had allied with the Vietnamese, and later Chinese regular units. This campaign between June 1883 and April 1886 aimed to impose the protectorate on the ground and secure the Red River Corridor. Prince Hong K. Viem, a leading Nguyen commander, cooperated with the Black Flag Army, complicating French efforts to implement the Treaty of Hue in Tonkin. The Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885, fought partly in Tonkin, ended with Chinese recognition of the French protectorate in northern Vietnam. After the war, a Tonkin Expeditionary Corps remained to enforce order and assist the civil authorities in consolidating French control. In April 1886, Tonkin was officially declared pacified, and the Expeditionary Corps was downgraded to a division of occupation. Yet resistance continued. The pacification of Tonkin from 1886 to 1896 was a prolonged military and political campaign aimed at suppressing guerrilla resistance and stabilizing French authority. French forces targeted remaining bands of Vietnamese insurgents and Chinese-led groups in both Delta and mountain regions. Governor-General Jean-Marie de la Nassau, appointed in 1891, played a key role in coordinating civil and military policies to complete the pacification. De la Nassau emphasized building administrative structures, infrastructure, and local militias to secure rural areas while reducing reliance on large expeditionary forces. By the mid-1890s, French officials reported that remaining armed groups in Tonkin were largely confined to remote areas and posed more of a policing challenge than a strategic threat. In both Annam and Tonkin, French authorities promoted local auxiliary forces and village militias to support pacification and maintain order at lower cost. Resistance in Annam during this period included various local and regional movements, but French control there was generally more indirect and negotiated through the Hue court. The administrative distinction between Annam and Tonkin was formalized on the 9th of May, 1889, when they were separated into two residences supérieures within French Indochina. After 1889, the resident superior of Annam and the resident superior of Tonkin exercised parallel but distinct authorities. Tonkin was effectively ruled directly by the French, with the imperial government in Hue exercising minimal practical authority there. In contrast, Annam preserved more visible royal structures, and the Nguyen court had a somewhat greater, though still constrained, role in internal administration. On the 27th of September, 1897, the Vietnamese Imperial Council in Annam was replaced by a council of ministers formally presided over by the French representative, further reducing Hue autonomy. By 1897, the resident superior in Annam effectively controlled major decisions on finance, appointments, and public works, leaving the emperor with limited ceremonial functions. The protectorate framework allowed France to claim respect for Vietnamese sovereignty while maintaining decisive control over foreign affairs, defense, and key internal policies. Administratively, Cochinchina's fully colonial status meant stronger integration with French law and institutions, whereas Annam and Tonkin preserved dual structures of French and Vietnamese administration. By the close of 1897, France had consolidated its protectorates in Annam and Tonkin through treaties, residency networks, and pacification campaigns, completing the basic framework of French rule over all three Vietnamese regions. The Nguyen Emperor remained on his throne in Hue, surrounded by the ceremonies of court life. Ministers still gathered in the imperial palace, and edicts were issued in the emperor's name. But the power to shape Vietnam's future had passed into other hands entirely. The protectorates of the center and north had been brought under new rules, rules written in French and enforced by French arms. The old Mandarin examinations still produced scholars, and the old hierarchies still functioned in their formal ways. Yet behind every provincial governor stood a French resident. Behind every decision of consequence stood French authority. The Nguyen court had been preserved, but only as a shell, useful for maintaining order while colonial transformation proceeded under French direction. On the 17th of October, 1887, France created a new political entity that would shape Southeast Asia for decades to come. The Indo-Chinese Union, known officially as Union Indochinoise and later generally called French Indochina, brought together Cochinchina, Annam, Tonkin, and the Kingdom of Cambodia into a single colonial federation. Laos would be added in 1893 following the Franco-Siamese crisis, extending the federation to 5 main territorial components. Within this union, Cochinchina retained its status as a colony under direct French rule, while Annam, Tonkin, Cambodia, and later Laos were designated protectorates. The distinction mattered in law and administration. A colony was fully French territory, governed directly by French law. A protectorate maintained a nominal local sovereign, even as French authorities controlled most aspects of governance. The federation was established to centralize control over these territories, coordinate policy, and facilitate economic and military integration across a vast region. Hanoi became the capital of the Indo-Chinese Union, housing the main offices of the Governor-General and Central Administration. This choice reflected Tonkin's strategic importance and placed the administrative heart of French Indochina in the north. From Hanoi, French authority radiated outward through a network of officials, residents, and military commands that reached into every province of the Federation. The Governor-General of French Indochina was the highest French official in the Federation and represented the French Republic in all its territories. Appointed by the French president and supervised by the Minister of Colonies in Paris, the Governor-General exercised broad political, military, civil, economic, financial, legal, and diplomatic authority. He possessed the power to organize the federal government offices of Indochina and define their functions and powers. He could promulgate decrees with both legislative and executive character, giving him a primary role in lawmaking for the entire federation. In military affairs, the Governor-General oversaw the organization and deployment of Indo-Chinese forces, although operational command in battle was delegated to senior officers. He supervised the French judicial system in Indochina, including courts that applied French law and those overseeing local jurisdictions. Early governors-general included figures such as Paul Doumer, who is often associated with reorganizing the Indo-Chinese administration and finances at the turn of the century. The Governor-General was assisted by a set of consultative bodies. The most important of these was the Indo-Chinese Supreme Council, later called the Indo-Chinese Government Council. This body gathered senior officials and experts to advise on general administrative and policy issues across the Federation. An Indo-Chinese Defense Council, also chaired by the Governor-General, provided advice on military organization, defense planning, and protection of the territories. Specialized consultative bodies existed for particular sectors. A mine consultancy committee and an education council addressed concerns in their respective domains. The Indo-Chinese Economic and Financial Interests Assembly offered a forum for business and financial interests, advising on taxation, tariffs, and investment policy. Despite these councils, final decisions on major issues rested with the Governor-General, who held supreme ruling power within Indochina. Each constituent territory retained its own local government. Cochin China was headed by a governor, while Annam, Tonkin, Cambodia, and Laos each had a resident superior. These local governors and resident superior reported to the Governor-General, who coordinated and, when necessary, overruled their policies. In Cochin China, the governor presided over a colonial administration more directly integrated into French legal and political structures than the protectorates. In Annam, Tonkin, Cambodia, and Laos, the resident superior operated alongside indigenous royal courts, but in practice held decisive authority. French sources often summarized the protectorate arrangement with a formula that captured the reality behind the formal structure. The king reigns, but the resident superior rules. Residents and residents de circle at provincial and district levels formed a dense bureaucracy through which the central administration exerted influence locally. Compared to Cochin China's colonial status, protectorate territories maintained more indigenous institutions but were subject to systematic oversight by French residents. The difference was one of form more than substance. Whether colony or protectorate, French authority ultimately prevailed. Federal finances in French Indochina combined revenues collected in each territory with central budgets managed by the Governor-General's administration. Before 1914, major development projects in Indochina were financed by metropolitan public loans, private French capital, and increasing local taxation. The Indo-Chinese budget covered expenditures for administration, infrastructure, education, and military forces stationed within the Federation. Indochina became a significant net contributor to the French Empire's finances, providing a large share of colonial financial transfers to metropolitan France in the early 20th century. Each territory had its own budget, but central authorities could reallocate resources and harmonize tax policies, giving the federal level substantial fiscal leverage. Taxation systems across the Federation included land taxes, head taxes, customs duties, and monopolies on commodities such as salt, alcohol, and opium. These revenues sustained the colonial state and funded its expanding apparatus. The federal administration regulated customs and external tariffs, using Indochina's ports to integrate the Federation into global trade networks. A unified Indo-Chinese customs regime helped tie the economies of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos more closely together under French control. Raw materials flowed outward through ports like Saigon and Haiphong, while manufactured goods from France flowed inward. The colonial economy was taking shape. Military forces in French Indochina consisted of metropolitan French units, colonial troops, and locally recruited soldiers and auxiliaries. The tirailleurs Indochinois were regiments of local infantry recruited from Vietnamese and Cambodian populations organized under French officers. These units played a central role in garrisoning the territories and supporting internal security operations. French troops and Indo-Chinese units were deployed throughout the Federation to guard borders, protect infrastructure, and assist civil authorities. Military command structures were subordinated to the Governor-General's authority, even though field operations were directed by senior army officers. Gendarmerie and police forces, including local auxiliaries, were organized to maintain order in towns, rural districts, and transportation corridors. The colonial bureaucracy expanded rapidly, staffed by French civil servants, military officers, and increasing numbers of trained local clerks. French was the language of central administration, while local languages continued in many lower courts and village-level procedures under French supervision. Education policy, guided by an Indo-Chinese Education Council, began to produce a small cadre of local elites trained in French-language schools for clerical and technical roles. The Federation's administrative hierarchy was strongly centralized, yet relied on cooperation with local elites and traditional authorities in protectorate territories. Annam and Tonkin, as protectorates with an active Nguyen monarchy, had more visible dual structures than Cambodia and Laos, where French residents often overshadowed royal courts. Federal regulations and decrees issued in Hanoi were transmitted to territorial administrations, which adapted and implemented them according to local circumstances. Norodom Palace in Saigon served as the residence of the Governor-General in the early years before Hanoi consolidated its role as the central administrative capital. The political administration of French Indochina evolved between 1887 and 1914 through successive decrees refining the balance between central control and territorial autonomy. By the eve of the First World War, the Indo-Chinese Union functioned as a tightly managed colonial federation with differentiated statuses for its territories, but unified under a single governor-general. The creation and consolidation of French Indochina between 1887 and 1914 established the institutional framework that would govern Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos for the following decades. From the Governor-General's palace in Hanoi to the smallest district outpost, a chain of command linked every corner of the Federation to French authority. Taxes flowed upward through provincial treasuries, decrees flowed downward through administrative channels, soldiers patrolled borders and highways, clerks filed reports in offices across the territory. A vast colonial structure had taken shape, one designed to extract wealth, maintain order, and project French power across Southeast Asia. Its architects believed they were building something permanent, a monument to French civilization in the tropics. The Federation would face challenges in the decades ahead, but for the moment, French Indochina stood as one of the most elaborate colonial constructions in Asia. The foundations had been laid, and the work of building upon them would continue. Between 1890 and 1930, Vietnam within French Indochina was progressively integrated into a colonial export economy centered on rice, rubber, minerals, and transport services. The land and its resources were increasingly organized not for the sustenance of local communities but for the enrichment of distant markets. This transformation reshaped the countryside, created new industries, and laid railway lines across terrain that had known only footpaths and waterways. Cochinchina, with its fertile Mekong Delta, remained the main rice-growing and rice-exporting region of Indochina during the early 20th century. Rice cultivation expanded through the extension of canals and dikes, enabling increased wet rice acreage across the delta's lowlands. Growing world demand for rice made Indochina one of the significant rice exporters in Asia before 1930, with Cochinchina contributing the largest share. Ships departed Saigon laden with grain bound for markets in Asia and beyond. Colonial land policies facilitated the concentration of delta land in the hands of large landlords and concessionaires, especially in Cochinchina. Many smallholders and tenants in rice-growing regions faced rising land rents and debts as large estates and credit systems expanded. The transformation of land tenure weakened many traditional communal landholding patterns, increasing the number of land-poor peasants who became reliant on working estates owned by others. A new agrarian order was emerging, one defined by absentee landlords, landless laborers, and the relentless pressure of production for export. From the late 19th century, French officials and agronomists promoted plantation agriculture in southern Vietnam, especially rubber, as a complement to rice exports. Rubber cultivation in Indochina developed most rapidly after 1900, with plantations concentrated in Cochinchina and neighboring areas of Cambodia. These plantations were typically established on concessions leased or granted by the colonial state, covering large, contiguous tracts of land. By the 1920s, Indochina had become an important producer of plantation rubber within the global rubber market. French tire companies invested directly in Indo-Chinese rubber plantations to secure stable supplies of latex at controlled prices. Michelin, the major French tire manufacturer, became one of the largest plantation investors in southern Vietnam. Michelin's first Indochina plantations were launched in the 1910s and 1920s, including large estates at Diu Ting and Phu Ring in Cochinchina. By 1927, these plantations together covered tens of thousands of acres, forming two of the largest single rubber estates in French Indochina. Rubber plantations in Cochinchina largely relied on labor recruited from densely populated northern and central Vietnam, especially Tonkin. Workers traveled south to toil on estates far from their home villages, bound by contracts that often left them at the mercy of plantation managers. The plantation sector's growth reshaped land use in upland and forested areas of Cochinchina and Annam, as forests were cleared for rows of rubber trees. Coffee, tea, and other commercial crops were cultivated on smaller scales in parts of Annam and the highlands, though rice and rubber remained dominant. Mining became a second major pillar of the colonial economy, particularly in northern Vietnam. Coal deposits in Tonkin, especially around Hon Gai and Cam Pha in Quang Yên province, were among the most important mineral resources exploited under French rule. The first mining sections at Hon Gai were ceded to the Société des Charbons de Hon Gai in 1888, forming the core of later coal operations that would expand dramatically in the following decades. The Société Française des Charbonnages du Tonkin became a leading coal company, controlling extensive concession areas around Hon Gai and Cam Pha. The mining area it controlled extended over more than 60,000 acres in this region. Coal output from Tonkin's mines rose from only a few thousand tons in 1890 to more than 500,000 tons by 1913. Production continued to grow, reaching around 1.7 million tons in 1929 and over 2 million tons in the late 1930s, reflecting the scale of Tonkin's coal industry. Tonkinese coal supplied both local needs and export markets, making Indochina a principal source of anthracite in the Far East. The coal mining industry attracted a large labor force, employing tens of thousands of workers by the 1930s. Other mining activities in Vietnam included zinc, tin, and other metals, particularly linked to cross-border trade with Yunnan via the railway that connected Vietnam with southern China. To support export-oriented agriculture and mining, the colonial authorities invested heavily in railway construction between 1890 and 1930. One of the most significant lines was the Yunnan Indochina Railway, linking the port of Haiphong with Kunming in Yunnan province. This line was completed in 1910, a remarkable engineering achievement that climbed from the coastal plains through mountain passes to reach the Chinese interior. The railway was conceived as a means for France to penetrate the Yunnan market and channel Chinese trade through Indo-Chinese ports. The railway from Haiphong to Hanoi and onward to Lao Cai formed the Vietnamese section of the Yunnan line. Within Vietnam, other key railways included the Hanoi-Long Son line toward the Chinese border and lines connecting Hanoi with Vinh and eventually Saigon over time. A north-south rail axis, later known as the Trans-Indochinese line, was developed gradually to connect Hanoi with Saigon across Annam. Railways were complemented by improved roads and river transport, creating an integrated transport network centered on ports like Haiphong and Saigon. Railway construction and operation were often carried out by concessionary companies under state supervision, with revenues derived from freight, passenger fares, and customs-linked trade. Customs duties and fees associated with rail-transported trade became an important revenue source for the Indo-Chinese administration. Financing the colonial economy relied on a combination of local taxation, customs revenues, and external loans raised by the French state. In Vietnam, main direct taxes included the head tax, land tax, and house tax, applied in various forms across Cochinchina, Annam, and Tonkin. Indirect taxes included monopolies and excise duties on salt, alcohol, opium, and other commodities. Tax systems were structured so that rural populations, especially peasants, provided a substantial share of colonial revenues. Village administrations were responsible for collecting many taxes from individual households and remitting them to higher levels of the colonial state. In addition to monetary taxes, the colonial regime maintained and adapted corvée labor obligations, especially for public works. Corvée labor was used for the construction and maintenance of roads, dikes, canals, and sometimes railway line segments. Labor for plantations, mines, and infrastructure came from both free wage contracts and various forms of recruited or obligatory labor. Recruitment of workers from Tonkin and Annam to Cochinchina plantations was often organized through labor brokers and official channels. These brokers traveled through villages in the north, promising wages and opportunities in the south. Many workers signed contracts that bound them to years of labor on distant estates, far from family and familiar surroundings. Mining enterprises in Tonkin employed large numbers of manual laborers, mostly Vietnamese, who descended into the earth to extract the coal that powered ships and factories. The colonial administration viewed Indochina's economic role as supplying raw materials to France and global markets. Rice, rubber, coal, and minerals flowed outward through the ports. The profits largely flowed elsewhere into the accounts of French companies and shareholders in Paris, Marseille, and Lyon. By the late 1920s, the combined effects of plantation agriculture, mining expansion, and railway development had made Vietnam the economic heartland of the Indo-Chinese Federation. The landscape had been transformed to serve colonial purposes. Forests had given way to orderly rows of rubber trees. Rice paddies stretched to the horizon in the Mekong Delta. Coal mines burrowed into the hills of Tonkin. Railways threaded through valleys and overpasses, carrying the wealth of the land toward the sea. The Vietnamese who worked this transformed landscape did so under conditions not of their choosing. Plantation workers lived in barracks, subject to strict discipline and the authority of overseers. Miners labored in dangerous conditions, vulnerable to accidents and disease. Tenant farmers paid ever-increasing rents to landlords they might never meet. The colonial economy created wealth, but that wealth was distributed according to colonial hierarchies. Yet, as the Great Depression began around 1930, falling world prices for rice and rubber would expose the vulnerabilities of this export-oriented economy. The system that had seemed so solid, so profitable, so permanent, rested on foundations that could shift with distant markets. The economy of extraction had reshaped Vietnam, but its future was tied to forces far beyond the rice paddies and rubber plantations where Vietnamese hands did the work. In the late 19th century, education in Vietnam under French rule gradually shifted from a Confucian classical system to a dual system combining French and Franco-Vietnamese schools. Before colonial reforms, Vietnamese state and private schools were largely based on Confucian texts and classical Chinese characters, known as Chu Han. Young men studied the ancient works, memorized poetry and philosophy, and prepared for examinations that could open doors to official positions. This tradition stretched back centuries, connecting Vietnam to the broader East Asian world of Confucian learning. After the mid-1880s, French authorities began constructing a Franco-Vietnamese education system intended to replace the traditional Confucian education and selection mechanisms. Early colonial education policy emphasized training interpreters and clerks for the army and civil administration in newly occupied territories. The colonial state needed Vietnamese who could read French documents, translate for officials, and manage the paperwork of governance. In Cochin, China, France established one of the first structured systems of Franco-Vietnamese schools during the initial decades of occupation. French educational reforms around 1906 reorganized curricula and school structures, marking a turning point in the spread of Franco-Vietnamese schooling. The reforms sought to make French-Vietnamese education more systematic and to undermine the prestige of what colonial administrators called feudal Confucian education. A second major education reform was initiated by Governor-General Albert Sarraut in late 1917, further defining education guidelines for Indochina. The 1917 General Rules of Academic Administration formally established French and Franco-Vietnamese schools as the core of the education system. Under Sarraut's reform, education in Vietnam was oriented toward general and practical training, with a primary goal of producing technical workers and civil servants for the colonial apparatus. French schools in Indochina mainly targeted French and European children, while Franco-Vietnamese schools were designed primarily for Vietnamese students. The two tracks existed side by side, reflecting the racial hierarchies of colonial society. In Franco-Vietnamese primary schools, instruction increasingly used Quoc Ngữ, the Romanized Vietnamese script, and French, rather than classical Chinese characters. The reforms allowed primary and lower elementary levels to be taught largely in Quoc Ngữ, with French progressively introduced as students advanced. French policy described Quoc Ngữ as a tool for carrying French ideas and culture to the Vietnamese population. The Romanized script was easier to learn than the complex Chinese characters, and colonial authorities believed it would facilitate the spread of French influence. By the early 20th century, Quoc Ngữ had become the main medium in many elementary schools, accelerating literacy in the Romanized script. A generation of Vietnamese was learning to read and write in a system that their grandparents had never known. Despite these reforms, overall school attendance remained limited. Only a minority of Vietnamese children received formal schooling before 1930. One study estimates that by the 1930s, no more than about 10% of Vietnamese obtained any formal education. Mission schools, especially Catholic institutions, played a parallel role by providing basic literacy, religious instruction, and some French language education. Catholic seminaries and colleges formed part of a wider transnational network in which some Vietnamese clerics and students pursued further studies abroad. Buddhist and other religious institutions also maintained teaching activities, though their influence waned relative to French-sponsored schools. Before their abolition, Confucian examinations remained the main route to official status for traditional literati in Annam and Tonkin. The Confucian court examination system in Vietnam dated back to 1075 and had operated for centuries as a civil service selection mechanism. French authorities began to interfere with the imperial examination system in the late 19th century, seeking to phase it out. The examinations were formally suspended by the French in 1913, though some local-level exams continued afterward. The last provincial and metropolitan Confucian exams in Vietnam were held between 1915 and 1919, making Vietnam the last country in the world to maintain such examinations. By abolishing the Confucian examination system, the colonial state removed the institutional foundation of the traditional scholar Mandarin elite. The end of the exam system coincided with the expansion of Franco-Vietnamese schools, encouraging young people to pursue Western-style education instead. The old path to prestige and power through mastery of classical texts was closing. A new path, through French language and colonial schools, was opening. French became the principal language of higher education, administration, and many urban professions in colonial Vietnam. Educational decrees encouraged and sometimes required the study of French at secondary and higher levels. Many colonial schools adopted bilingual curricula, teaching both French and Quoc Ngữ, with French often dominating in advanced classes. Teacher training schools were created to prepare Vietnamese instructors for primary and Franco-Vietnamese schools. These training institutions emphasized pedagogy, French language competence, and basic technical subjects to meet colonial administrative needs. Normal schools for teachers were established in regions such as Tonkin and Cochin China to ensure a steady supply of trained Vietnamese teachers. Curricula in Franco-Vietnamese schools combined arithmetic, history, geography, and basic science with moral and civic instruction framed by colonial policy. French colonial education emphasized practical skills useful for clerical, technical, and commercial employment rather than classical literary training. Secondary schools modeled on French lycées provided a more advanced curriculum, including French literature, mathematics, and sometimes Latin. Access to secondary education remained restricted. Only a small proportion of Vietnamese students advanced beyond the primary level. By the 1920s and 1930s, a Western-educated Vietnamese intelligentsia had formed, active in the press, literature, arts, and scientific fields. Many of these new intellectuals came from families of former literati, small landlords, or urban middle strata who invested in French language education. Western-educated elites often mastered both French and Quoc Ngữ, enabling them to work within colonial institutions and contribute to a growing print culture. The expansion of Quoc Ngữ literacy facilitated the rise of Vietnamese newspapers, journals, and novels in the early 20th century. New intellectual circles emerged in cities such as Hanoi, Saigon, and Hue, centered on schools, libraries, and publishing houses. Some Western-educated Vietnamese pursued further studies in France, Japan, or other countries, creating transnational educational networks that would shape future political developments. The presence of educated women increased gradually. By the 1920s, a small but growing number of Vietnamese girls attended mission and Franco-Vietnamese schools. Access to schooling, particularly at higher levels, became an important route for social mobility among Vietnamese seeking salaried positions. New occupational groups emerged, including teachers, clerks, technicians, and lawyers trained through colonial schools. Many village-level schools remained under local funding, especially after regulations required villages to maintain a primary school when possible. By 1930, education reforms had created a layered system in Vietnam, with limited but influential Western-educated elites coexisting with a broader population having little or no formal schooling. The Dung Du movement, launched by the reformer Phan Boi Cho around 1905, encouraged Vietnamese youth to study in Japan as an alternative to French institutions. This movement represented one response to the changing educational landscape, an attempt by Vietnamese nationalists to seek modern learning outside the colonial system. Some young men traveled to Japan, seeking knowledge that might one day help them challenge French rule. The new scripts in schools had begun to reshape Vietnamese society. Young people who might once have devoted years to memorizing classical texts now learned arithmetic and geography in French-style classrooms. Writers who might once have composed poetry in Chinese characters now wrote articles and stories in Quoc Ngữ for newspapers and magazines. A new kind of Vietnamese intellectual was emerging, one comfortable with Western ideas yet still rooted in Vietnamese culture. The old order of Confucian scholars and Mandarin officials was giving way to something new, something neither entirely Vietnamese nor entirely French. Teachers trained in colonial normal schools returned to their villages to educate the next generation. Clerks trained in Franco-Vietnamese schools took positions in colonial offices. A small number of professionals, lawyers, and doctors trained in France established practices in Saigon and Hanoi. The young people sitting in Franco-Vietnamese classrooms in the 1910s and 1920s would become the journalists, teachers, and activists of the 1930s and 1940s. Some would serve the colonial system, others would work to overthrow it. All would be shaped by the schools and scripts that colonial policy had introduced and that Vietnamese had made their own. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Vietnamese reformist and modernist movements arose among literati and new Western-educated elites, seeking alternatives to existing colonial and monarchical structures. These thinkers grappled with fundamental questions. How could Vietnam regain its independence? How could Vietnamese society be strengthened to meet the challenges of the modern world? Different answers emerged, different paths were proposed, and different methods debated. Phan Boi Cho, born in 1867 in Nghe Province, was a classically trained scholar who became one of the most active early nationalist reformers. After passing the regional examination in 1900, Phan Boi Cho increasingly turned from conventional official ambitions toward political activism. The old path of serving the imperial court no longer seemed adequate to meet the crisis facing Vietnam. Something new was needed. In May of 1904, Phan Boi Cho and associates founded the Dui Ten Hoi, the Association for Modernization, at the house of Tiêu Lung Nguyen Ham in central Vietnam. The association's stated goal was to recover Vietnam and build an independent government. The association chose Prince Cuong Dae, a member of a cadet branch of the Nguyen royal family, as its nominal leader, hoping that dynastic legitimacy would attract supporters. Du Tan Hoi set three main tasks: expanding membership and financial support, preparing for eventual conflict and its aftermath, and organizing overseas activities. Around 1905, Phan Boi Cho launched the Dung Du movement, encouraging Vietnamese youth to study in Japan. Dung Du, meaning go east, was conceived as a way to learn from Japan's rapid modernization and to train future cadres for Vietnam's national revival. Japan's recent victory over Russia in the War of 1904 to 1905 had electrified Asia. Here was proof that an Asian nation could master Western methods and defeat a European power. Between 1905 and 1908, the Dung Du movement brought over 200 young Vietnamese to Japan for study and political training. Phan Boi Cho himself lived in Japan from 1905 to 1908, writing political tracts and networking with Japanese politicians and activists. Vietnamese supporters inside the country, including figures such as Trần Chinh Chieu and Nguyen Thanh Hien in Cochin, China, helped fund the Dung Du students through study promotion programs. Financial backing relied on donations from wealthy families and merchants sympathetic to modernization and national revival. While in Japan, Phan Boi Cho hoped for official Japanese support but ultimately received limited backing from the government. Under pressure from French diplomacy, Japanese authorities eventually expelled most Dung Du students in 1908, forcing them and Phan Boi Cho to disperse. The dream of building a Vietnamese movement under Japanese protection had ended, at least for the moment. After leaving Japan, Phan Boi Cho moved his center of activity to China, where he interacted with Chinese revolutionaries including Sun Yat-sen. Influenced by Sun, Phan Boi Cho gradually shifted from a purely monarchist stance toward more democratic and republican ideas. In 1912, he dissolved Duy Tan Hoi and founded the Vietnam Quang Phuc Hoi, the Vietnam Restoration League, modeled partly on Chinese republican organizations. This new league adopted a more explicitly republican program, aiming to overthrow colonial rule and establish a modern state. Throughout this period, Phan Boi Cho authored historical and political works that criticized colonial rule and promoted national consciousness. French colonial authorities tracked his activities abroad and sought cooperation from Japan and China to restrict his movements. The reach of colonial surveillance extended far beyond Vietnam's borders. Within Vietnam, reformist ideas also developed around Phan Cho Trinh, born in 1872 in Quang Nam. Like Phan Boi Cho, Phan Cho Trinh initially trained within the Confucian examination system and held a local Mandarin post before turning to reform. But unlike Phan Boi Cho, Phan Cho Trinh rejected violent uprisings and foreign alliances, advocating nonviolent reform and cooperation with the French for gradual change. Phan Cho Trinh emphasized three goals summarized as civil education, civil mobilization, and civil livelihood. Civil education meant abolishing bookish classical learning and exams, promoting vernacular education, and spreading scientific knowledge. He called for the removal of superstitious customs and conservative practices, with an emphasis on new schools, newspapers, and public lectures. In a 1906 letter to Governor-General Paul Bo, Phan Cho Trinh argued that Vietnam's weakness stemmed from feudal institutions. He urged the French administration to introduce modern education, legal reforms, and economic development to transform Vietnamese society. He visited Japan briefly around 1906, but, unlike Phan Boi Cho, did not pursue a Japan-centered strategy for national liberation. Instead, he placed his hopes in reform from within, believing that France might eventually grant greater rights to a modernized Vietnamese society. In contrast with Phan Boi Cho's monarchist revolutionary line, Phan Cho Trinh strongly criticized monarchy and advocated democratic principles. Reformist thinking in this period thus featured two broad tendencies: Phan Boi Cho's emphasis on armed struggle and external alliances, and Phan Cho Trinh's focus on internal reform and education. Both reformers agreed on the need to save the country and save the people, but they differed profoundly on methods, alliances, and the desired political form. The Duy Tan movement in central Vietnam, associated with Phan Cho Trinh and other reformers, promoted modernization in education, economic self-strengthening, and social customs. Activists encouraged establishing modern schools, cooperatives, and local economic associations to strengthen Vietnamese capabilities. The Dung Kinh Gia Thuc, or Tonkin Free School, in Hanoi became a notable modernist educational initiative. Founded in March of 1907, the school was organized by Lung Vung Can and other intellectuals, with participation from figures such as Phan Bội Châu and Phan Châu Trinh. The school offered free courses to the public, aiming to modernize Vietnamese society through new curricula and teaching methods. Subjects taught at the Tonkin Free School included science, hygiene, geography, and French, along with civic and moral education. The school promoted Quoc Nhu as the main script, publishing educational materials and newspapers in Romanized Vietnamese instead of classical characters. Reformist lectures at the school criticized conservative Confucian learning and praised new knowledge from the West and Japan. In August of 1907, Phan Châu Trinh lectured at the Tonkin Free School on topics such as monarchical rule and democratic rule and Eastern and Western ethics. His lectures further developed critiques of monarchy and introduced ideas about democracy and citizenship to urban audiences. The Tonkin Free School movement sought to combine cultural revival with educational reform and expressions of patriotism. French authorities initially tolerated the Tonkin Free School, which operated legally for several months in 1907. But in late 1907 and early 1908, amid unrest including tax protests in Annam, the French administration associated the school's leaders with political agitation. The Tonkin Free School was closed by authorities in November of 1907, and its leading figures were arrested or placed under surveillance. Publications associated with the school were suppressed, limiting the formal existence of the movement but not its longer-term intellectual influence. Modernist newspapers and journals in Quoc Nhu proliferated during the early 20th century, providing forums for debate on reform and modernization. Writers and thinkers linked to these movements used print media to discuss constitutionalism, public morality, economic development, and national identity. French colonial authorities regarded both currents with suspicion, monitoring them closely. By 1915, Vietnamese reformist and modernist movements had created a network of organizations, schools, and publications that linked domestic intellectuals with contacts in Japan and China. These early reformers and modernists helped shape subsequent generations of Vietnamese political thinkers, including later figures who would engage with their writings and carry their struggles forward. Imperial and colonial officials used arrests, exile, and surveillance to limit the organizational capacity of reformist movements. Reformist debates often focused on whether to preserve the monarchy as a symbol under a reformed system or to replace it with a republican structure. The modernizers had emerged from the old world of Confucian learning, but were reaching towards something new. They had seen that Vietnam could not survive unchanged in a world of steamships and telegraphs, of colonial armies and international commerce. They sought to awaken their countrymen, to build new institutions, to prepare for a future that might include independence. The seeds they planted in these early years would bear fruit in ways they could not have predicted. The schools they founded were suppressed, the organizations they built were scattered. But the ideas they introduced would continue to circulate, passed from teacher to student, from writer to reader. The modernizers had opened a door that could not easily be closed. The Con Vung movement was a large-scale insurgency that swept across Vietnam from 1885 to about 1896, calling on subjects to support Emperor Ham Nhi against French rule. The words Con Vung mean aid the king, and they became a rallying cry for those who refused to accept the treaties and protectorates that had placed their country under foreign control. The movement began after Regent Ton Tuc Thuert launched a failed attack on French positions in Hue in July of 1885. When that assault failed, Ton Tuc Thuert escorted Emperor Ham Nhi into the mountains away from the capital that had fallen under French domination. From his refuge in the highlands, the young emperor issued an edict urging officials and commoners to aid the king. This call became the ideological foundation of the Kung Vung movement, linking loyalty to the dynasty with resistance to foreign occupation. Kung Vung resistance was strongest in Annam and parts of Tonkin, where scholar gentry leaders mobilized peasants to attack colonial posts and Vietnamese who collaborated with the French. Ton Thuc Thuert remained one of the most prominent political figures associated with the movement, coordinating resistance in the early phase. The movement combined loyalty to the Nguyen dynasty with opposition to foreign domination, presenting itself as defense of both the monarchy and the country. Local leaders emerged across the central and northern regions. Phan Dinh Phung in central Vietnam organized long-running campaigns under the Kung Vung banner. His forces operated mainly in Ha Tinh and surrounding provinces, using mountainous terrain as a base from which to strike at colonial forces. In Binh Dinh and neighboring provinces, other Kung Vung leaders mobilized local communities, though some later made arrangements with the French when military pressure became unbearable. By 1887, the French had re-established control over southern Annam, with many Kung Vung fighters in that region surrendering or disbanding. The movement formally weakened after Emperor Ham Nhi was captured in 1888 and sent into exile in Algeria. Without the emperor to rally around, the movement lost much of its symbolic power. Yet scattered resistance continued throughout the early 1890s, especially in remote or mountainous rural areas where French control remained incomplete. French responses to Kung Vung included military expeditions, administrative restructuring, and closer surveillance of scholar gentry families suspected of sympathies with the insurgents. The movement's suppression marked a transition from court-centered resistance to more localized and diverse forms of rural opposition. The great cause had failed, but the spirit of resistance did not entirely disappear. After Kung Vung, some local leaders continued resistance as band-like groups, blurring boundaries between political insurgency and rural outlawry. In the northern province of Yên Thế, a leader known as Dae Tam, whose personal name was Hoang Hoa Tam, led one of the longest-lasting rural resistance centers against French authority. Dae Tam's activities around Yên Thế lasted roughly from the late 1880s until his death in 1913, involving repeated clashes and negotiations with the colonial state. The Yên Thế resistance drew on peasant support in forested uplands of northeastern Tonkin, taking advantage of difficult terrain that favored guerrilla tactics. The French conducted several campaigns against Dae Tam's forces, but often alternated between military pressure and attempts at local agreements that might pacify the region without prolonged warfare. Dae Tam was ultimately assassinated in 1913, which colonial authorities interpreted as closing a long chapter of rural insurgency in that region. His death marked the end of one of the most persistent armed resistance movements of the colonial period. But rural discontent did not end with his passing. Rural hardship under colonial taxation, land concentration, and labor obligations contributed to recurrent local protests and uprisings throughout this era. Peasant grievances frequently centered on land rents, corvée labor demands, and the conduct of local officials involved in tax collection. Villages that had supported themselves for generations found their surplus extracted to fund colonial administration and development projects that benefited others. In 1908, a significant anti-tax movement broke out in central Vietnam, particularly in Quang Nam, Quangai, and around Hue. Demonstrators protested increases in taxes and corvée obligations, presenting petitions and marching in groups to district centers. A visible symbol of the 1908 protests was the forcible cutting of men's traditional long hair queues, signaling rejection of old status distinctions and perhaps of the old order itself. French authorities blamed reformers such as Fan Bocho and other activists for encouraging the anti-tax demonstrations. The 1908 unrest also led to accusations against local figures like Chen Cao-van for inciting tax riots in their regions. Colonial responses to the movement included arrests, trials, and the exile or imprisonment of scholar activists on islands such as Pulo Condor. Administrative measures after 1908 sought to tighten control over village finances and to monitor scholar gentry suspected of political involvement. In many rural areas, resistance took religious or millenarian forms, drawing on prophecies and charismatic leaders rather than formal political platforms. Some movements invoked Buddhist, Confucian, or syncretic beliefs, promising moral renewal and improved conditions for peasants suffering under colonial pressures. Millenarian leaders sometimes claimed special powers or prophetic visions, attracting followers from among smallholders and landless laborers who had little to lose and much to hope for. Religious gatherings and festivals could serve as occasions to spread messages critical of local authorities or colonial policies. In rural Cochin China, colonial reports noted repeated small-scale disturbances linked to religious preachers and village notables. These movements rarely threatened colonial control directly, but they demonstrated the depth of rural discontent and the variety of forms it could take. Local resistance also targeted specific administrative measures, such as new regulations on opium, alcohol monopolies, or compulsory labor. In some cases, villagers refused to perform corvée work on roads or dikes, forcing administrators to combine persuasion with police or military escorts. Rural protests in this period were often localized, lacking direct coordination with urban intellectual movements, though they sometimes referenced reformist slogans about justice and popular rights. Anti-tax and anti-labor protests occasionally overlapped with efforts by reformist groups to promote boycotts or local self-help associations. Colonial authorities used intelligence networks based on village notables, interpreters, and local militia to monitor potential unrest. In Tonkin and Annam, the existence of protectorate institutions meant that both French residents and Vietnamese mandarins participated in responses to rural disturbances. French administrators sometimes replaced local officials judged unable to maintain order, reshaping village leadership structures to ensure compliance. Judicial responses to uprisings ranged from administrative detention and exile to trials in colonial courts applying French or adapted local law. The penalties could be severe: years of imprisonment, deportation to remote islands, or worse. The experience of participation in Kung Vung, N-Tay, and anti-tax movements left a legacy of rural mobilization that later political organizations would seek to draw upon. The countryside had shown that it could resist, even if that resistance had been ultimately defeated. The memory of those who had risen against colonial rule would endure, passed down through families and villages, waiting for a time when conditions might again favor those who sought to challenge the foreign power that ruled their land. The patterns of rural resistance during this period revealed both the strengths and limitations of peasant movements. Villagers could be mobilized around concrete grievances about taxes and labor. Local leaders could draw on networks of kinship, religious affiliation, and community loyalty. Difficult terrain could shelter guerrilla bands for years, But without broader coordination, without access to modern weapons, without allies in the cities or abroad, these movements could be isolated and suppressed one by one. The colonial state had learned from these challenges. It had developed systems of surveillance and intelligence gathering. It had cultivated collaborators among village elites. It had built roads and telegraph lines that allowed rapid response to disturbances. It had shown willingness to use overwhelming force when necessary and flexibility when that seemed more effective. The countryside had been pacified, but not entirely subdued. Beneath the surface of colonial order, the grievances remained. Taxes continued to be collected. Corvée labor continued to be demanded. Land continued to concentrate in fewer hands. The gap between the promises of colonial civilization and the realities of peasant life remained as wide as ever. The uprisings in the countryside had been suppressed, but the conditions that had produced them had not been resolved. The embers of rural discontent continued to smolder, waiting for a wind to fan them back into flame. Between 1900 and 1930, Saigon, Ceylon, Hanoi, and Haiphong developed as the main urban centers of French Indochina, concentrating administration, trade, and services in ways that transformed Vietnamese society. These cities became nodes in a colonial network that linked villages to global markets, that gathered tax revenues and exported raw materials, that educated new elites and employed new kinds of workers. Saigon Ceylon in Cochinchina formed the largest urban agglomeration in Vietnam during the colonial period, combining a European quarter with extensive Chinese and Vietnamese commercial districts. The twin cities sprawled along the Saigon River, their wharves busy with ships loading rice and rubber for distant ports. Hanoi, designated the capital of French Indochina in 1902, became the political and administrative center for northern and central Vietnam. From the Governor-General's palace, directives flowed outward to every corner of the Federation. Haiphong grew as the principal maritime outlet for Tonkin, serving as the main export port for coal and other goods from northern Vietnam. Urban populations increased steadily in Saigon, Hanoi, and Haiphong as migrants from rural areas sought wage work in construction, docks, workshops, and services. By the early 20th century, Vietnamese residents formed the numerical majority in these cities, though Europeans and Chinese communities played prominent economic roles. The cities offered opportunities that villages could not, even if those opportunities often meant hard labor for modest wages. A distinct urban working class emerged, composed of dock workers, coolies, rickshaw pullers, factory hands, servants, and casual laborers. Dock workers in Saigon and Haiphong handled rice, coal, and general cargo, often employed through labor contractors on daily or short-term contracts. Coal ports near Haiphong, such as Hon Gai and Cam Pha, drew large numbers of miners and transport workers linked to the Tonkin coal industry. Rickshaw pulling became a major urban occupation in Hanoi and Saigon from the 1910s through the mid-1930s. The vehicles, introduced as a wheeled alternative to sedan chairs, provided short-distance transport for middle-income residents and officials. Many rickshaw pullers were migrants from rural Tonkin and Annam, living in rented rooms or makeshift housing in peripheral neighborhoods. They waited in ranks along major streets, hoping for fares that would cover their daily rental fees and leave something for food. Wage levels for unskilled urban workers were often measured in rice equivalents. Data from the period indicate that real wages and welfare ratios in Saigon were generally above those in Hanoi for similar categories of unskilled workers. A small but growing industrial workforce developed in light manufacturing, food processing, and later in railway workshops and small factories. Urban households frequently combined wage labor with petty trade, domestic service, or craft work to supplement incomes. Alongside the working class, a colonial middle class emerged, including clerks, teachers, minor officials, technicians, and small shopkeepers. Many of these middle-class positions required literacy in Quoc Ngu and often knowledge of French, linking them to the colonial school system. Vietnamese clerks and administrative employees worked in colonial offices, banks, trading firms, and transport companies. A small number of Vietnamese lawyers, doctors, and journalists trained in colonial or overseas institutions also clustered in these cities. Chinese merchants and business families in Saigon, Cholon, and Haiphong operated many wholesale and retail enterprises, rice mills, and warehouses. They formed a crucial commercial intermediary between Vietnamese producers and global markets. European colons and firms held major stakes in banking, shipping, plantations, and larger commercial houses headquartered in Saigon and Hanoi. Urban housing patterns reflected social and racial hierarchies. European quarters were characterized by planned streets and masonry villas, while Vietnamese quarters were more densely built with narrower lanes. In Saigon, the European center featured broad boulevards and villas near administrative buildings, while Vietnamese and Chinese districts were more crowded and mixed use. Hanoi's French Quarter south and east of Hoang Kim Lake developed wide avenues, public buildings, and garden villas, in contrast to the denser old quarter of guild streets where craftsmen and traders had worked for centuries. Municipal authorities invested in street lighting, drainage, and water supply networks, especially in central districts. Hanoi installed oil street lamps in the late 19th century and later moved toward electric lighting, transforming the appearance of public spaces after dark. By the early 1900s, the Hanoi Electric Tramway Company operated electric tram lines covering about 12 kilometers within the city. Tramways connected administrative quarters, commercial streets, and the railway station, facilitating commuting and urban circulation. Saigon also developed tramway and later bus services, linking central areas with suburbs such as Cholon. Rickshaws remained the most widely used form of personal transport for many urban residents who could not afford other options. Public markets were central features of urban life. In Saigon, the Ben Thanh and Cholon markets served as major hubs for food and daily goods. Hanoi's Dong Xuan market became a principal wholesale and retail market in the northern capital. Markets provided employment for vendors, porters, and small traders, with women playing a significant role in petty commerce. Urbanization brought new public amenities such as parks, promenades, and riverfront embankments used for leisure walks and gatherings. Cafes and coffee houses appeared along major streets in Saigon and Hanoi, frequented by officials, clerks, journalists, and students. These establishments, often modeled on French cafes, served as informal meeting places for discussion of news and literature. Beer halls and small restaurants also multiplied, catering to both European and Vietnamese urban populations. Urban theaters and cinemas were introduced, offering traditional Vietnamese performances, French plays, and later film screenings. Hanoi and Saigon hosted theaters where Kai Lung, Reformed theater, and other modern forms began to develop in the early 20th century. The growth of Quoc Ngu print culture led to a proliferation of newspapers, journals, and books in these cities. Journalists, printers, and booksellers formed an important segment of the urban middle strata. Public schools, lycées, and private academies were concentrated in urban centers, contributing to the formation of educated youth communities. Hospitals and clinics were established in Saigon, Hanoi, and Haiphong, combining military, missionary, and civil medical services. Urban daily life incorporated both colonial and local elements, with Western clothing, bicycles, and new leisure activities alongside traditional markets and religious practices. Sidewalk vendors, street food stalls, and itinerant hawkers were common in urban streetscapes, providing affordable meals and goods. Municipal regulations sought to manage street vending, sanitation, and building standards, though enforcement varied between districts. Urban social differentiation was visible in consumption patterns, with middle classes accessing electricity, trams, cafes, and newspapers more readily than poorer residents. Housing shortages and rising rents in some periods led to the expansion of peripheral neighborhoods around major cities. Religious institutions remained important in urban neighborhoods, hosting festivals and community meetings. Pagodas, churches, and communal houses provided continuity with older ways of life even as the cities transformed around them. By 1930, Saigon, Hanoi, and Haiphong had become key centers of new social classes, cultural activities, and political currents. The cities had risen, and with them, a new Vietnam was taking shape. The urban landscape told a story of colonial ambition and Vietnamese adaptation. Broad French boulevards gave way to narrow Vietnamese lanes. European villas stood near crowded tenements. Modern tramways passed sidewalk vendors selling traditional foods. The people who filled these cities were themselves being transformed. Workers who had arrived from villages learned new trades and new ways of thinking about their place in society. Students who gathered in schools and cafes discussed ideas that would have been unimaginable to their grandparents. Journalists wrote in a script that allowed ideas to spread more quickly than ever before. A new generation was coming of age in these urban spaces, a generation that lived between two worlds. The cities of French Indochina were laboratories of change, places where the old and the new collided and combined. They concentrated the contradictions of colonial rule, wealth and poverty, privilege and exploitation, modernization and oppression. They brought together people from different backgrounds and exposed them to new possibilities. The rising cities would become centers of political agitation in the years ahead as the working class and the educated middle class found common cause in challenging the colonial order that had created them. For now, the cities continued to grow. Ships continued to arrive at Saigon and Haiphong. Migrants continued to pour in from the countryside. Buildings continued to rise. The transformation of urban Vietnam was still underway, and no one could say with certainty where it would lead. Between the turn of the century and the summer of 1914, Vietnamese nationalism took shape not as a single movement, but as a constellation of overlapping networks. Scholar gentry, who had grown up within the Confucian examination system, found themselves sharing common cause with younger men educated in Franco-Vietnamese schools. Secret societies passed messages through trusted intermediaries. Overseas activists in Japan and China published pamphlets that circulated hand-to-hand back home. None of these strands operated in isolation. Together, they formed the first tentative architecture of organized opposition to colonial rule. Much of this early nationalism grew from the legacy of earlier resistance. The Kung Vung movement had demonstrated that armed opposition was possible, even if ultimately unsuccessful. Rural insurgencies had shown that ordinary people could be mobilized against foreign domination. These precedents lingered in collective memory, providing both inspiration and cautionary lessons for those who now sought new methods of confronting colonial authority. Reformist groups played a dual role during this period. Organizations such as Duy Tân Hoi, founded by Phan Boi Cho in 1904, presented themselves publicly as associations dedicated to modernization and self-improvement. Behind this facade, they functioned as embryonic political organizations with clandestine cells spread across the country. Sympathizers among literati and local notables provided safe houses, funds, and channels of communication. The line between cultural renewal and political conspiracy was deliberately blurred. From 1905 onward, the Đông Du movement added an international dimension to Vietnamese nationalism. Young men traveled to Japan not merely to acquire technical knowledge, but to absorb lessons about how an Asian nation might modernize rapidly and resist Western encroachment. In dormitories and study circles in Tokyo and Yokohama, Vietnamese students discussed statecraft, military organization, and national revival. Between 1905 and 1908, over 200 young Vietnamese made their way to Japan for study and political training. They attended schools and even military academies, imagining themselves as future leaders of a transformed homeland. Phan Boi Cho himself spent years abroad, first in Japan and later in China. He wrote prolifically, producing pamphlets in both Chinese and Vietnamese that analyzed colonial oppression and called for resistance. These texts circulated through underground channels, reaching readers who might never travel beyond their villages. His writings helped shape a vocabulary of national consciousness that transcended regional and class boundaries. Vietnamese activists in Japan cultivated relationships with Japanese politicians and Pan-Asian intellectuals who spoke of solidarity among Asian peoples against Western imperialism. Yet official Japanese support remained limited. When French diplomats pressed Tokyo to act against the Vietnamese students, Japanese authorities eventually complied. French consular reports from Tokyo had been monitoring the students closely, sending detailed information back to colonial authorities in Hanoi. In 1908, under sustained French pressure, Japanese authorities expelled most of the Đông Du students. The network that had taken years to build was scattered almost overnight. Phan Boi Cho and his associates dispersed to China, where new possibilities and new dangers awaited them. The expulsion marked the end of the Japanese phase of Vietnamese overseas activism. But it did not end the movement itself. Southern China became the next center of exile politics. Canton and later Shanghai offered relative proximity to Vietnam and access to Chinese revolutionary circles. Phan Boi Cho established contact with Sun Yat-sen and other Chinese nationalists, absorbing ideas about republicanism and revolutionary organization. The overthrow of the Qing dynasty in 1911 profoundly influenced Vietnamese thinking about political alternatives. In 1912, Phan Boi Cho dissolved Du Tan Hoi and founded the Vietnam Quang Phuc Hoi, an organization with a more explicitly Republican program aimed at overthrowing colonial rule. The Quang Phuc Hoi worked to coordinate underground activities inside Vietnam. Members smuggled propaganda across the border, moving pamphlets and sometimes weapons through frontier zones where surveillance was difficult. French and Chinese authorities cooperated intermittently on monitoring these networks, exchanging information about suspected revolutionaries. Border posts in Tonkin maintained intelligence networks using local informants such as peddlers and innkeepers to report on unusual movements. Inside Vietnam, nationalist ideas spread through channels that avoided direct confrontation with colonial power. Secret discussion groups met in private homes, sometimes disguised as literary clubs or study associations. Book clubs imported works on Japanese modernization, Chinese reform movements, and Western political philosophy. Underground publishing houses issued tracts on national history and political reform, often in quick new, to reach readers beyond the classical elite. Censorship regulations required printed material to be submitted to colonial authorities before distribution. This drove much publishing into clandestine channels. Texts circulated in manuscript form or were printed secretly and distributed through trusted networks. The content often took the form of historical narratives and moral essays rather than explicit manifestos. Authors wrote about past heroes and ancient glories, leaving readers to draw their own conclusions about the present situation. The Tonkin Free School represented another important strand of this complex movement. Through public lectures in 1907, figures such as Phan Cho Trinh introduced urban audiences to ideas about democracy, constitutional government, and the comparison between Eastern and Western civilizations. In August of that year, Phan Cho Trinh lectured on topics including monarchical rule versus democratic rule and the differences between Eastern and Western ethics. Police reports noted these lectures carefully as evidence of dangerous political tendencies. The school's closure in November 1907 and the arrest of its leaders did not eliminate the intellectual currents it had helped popularize. Newspapers and journals in Quốc ngữ proliferated during the early 20th century, providing forums for debate on reform, modernization, and national identity. Writers used print media to discuss constitutionalism, public morality, economic development, and what it meant to be Vietnamese in a colonial world. Vietnamese nationalists used pseudonyms and coded language in correspondence to evade detection. Colonial postal services intercepted letters, so activists developed methods to communicate without revealing their full intentions. Abroad, some Vietnamese students in France formed small circles in Paris, exchanging ideas about socialism, liberalism, and nationalism. Police archives indicate that Vietnamese activists in France maintained contact with counterparts in Indochina, Japan, and China, forming a dispersed transnational network. French Indochinese police used informants and international cooperation to arrest or expel activists abroad, including attempts to detain Phan Boi Cho himself. Within Vietnam, some clandestine associations adopted forms reminiscent of traditional secret societies, complete with initiation rituals and oaths of loyalty. These groups sometimes combined Confucian, Buddhist, or popular religious symbolism with political aims, blurring the line between traditional organizations and modern nationalist cells. Religious festivals and temple fairs became opportunities to circulate pamphlets and discuss current events beyond the watchful eyes of administrators. In Cochinchina, urban associations in Saigon and Cholon brought together journalists, businessmen, and students who discussed constitutional reforms. These early reformers focused on petitions, legal appeals, and newspaper campaigns rather than clandestine violence. They framed demands in terms of rights, renovation, and civilization, drawing on global discourses of progress. International events shaped Vietnamese nationalist thinking during this period. The Japanese victory over Russia in 1905 was interpreted by many Vietnamese as evidence that an Asian country could successfully challenge a European power. The Chinese Revolution of 1911 encouraged some to consider republican models for Vietnam. Nationalist groups inside the country remained fragmented, with differences over monarchy versus republicanism, methods of struggle, and relations with foreign powers. French colonial authorities distinguished between reformist and revolutionary nationalists, though both remained under close observation. Surveillance dossiers tracked teachers, students, and journalists suspected of political involvement. Trials used charges such as conspiracy, sedition, or unlawful association. Sentences included imprisonment, fines, and deportation to penal islands like Pulo Condor. Despite repression and fragmentation, the period before the First World War established networks, discourses, and practices that later movements would build upon. By July 1914, Vietnamese nationalism existed as a constellation of reformist circles, secret societies, exile organizations, and monitored publications rather than unified mass parties. The infrastructure of opposition was in place, waiting for circumstances that might allow these scattered efforts to coalesce into something more powerful. At the outbreak of the First World War, Vietnam remained part of French Indochina, a colonial possession far removed from the trenches of Europe. Yet the conflict that engulfed the continent would reach across oceans to draw upon Indochina's population in ways that transformed the experiences of tens of thousands of Vietnamese men. Between 1914 and 1918, around 93,000 men from Indochina, the vast majority of them Vietnamese, were sent to France as soldiers and workers. Their long journeys across the world and their years of service would leave lasting marks on all those who survived to return home. The wartime mobilization drew men mainly from Tonkin and Annam, regions where population density was high and where colonial recruitment networks were already well established throughout the countryside. Indochina's population at the time numbered under 17 million, making the recruitment of nearly 100,000 men a significant extraction of manpower from the colonial territory. Of the total sent to France, approximately 49,000 Vietnamese served as civilian workers in factories, arsenals, shipyards, and other war-related industries. These workers formed the largest contingent of Indochinese in France during the war years, laboring far from home to fuel the machinery of modern industrial warfare. Tens of thousands more served as soldiers in the Tirailleurs Indochinois and other military formations. The Tirailleurs Indochinois regiments, composed mainly of Vietnamese and some Cambodians, represented the core of Indochinese combat forces deployed to support the French war effort. Around 40,000 of these soldiers were sent to France, though most were employed in rear area duties rather than sustained frontline combat. Approximately 4,800 Vietnamese served in combat battalions, participating directly in operations at the front. Another 24,000 served in transit and depot battalions, handling logistics, convoy movements, and camp duties throughout the rear areas of the Western Front. Around 9,000 Vietnamese were employed as colonial medical staff working as orderlies, stretcher bearers, or auxiliary personnel in hospitals and aid stations behind the lines. These men witnessed firsthand the carnage of industrial warfare and the terrible toll it took on human bodies. Their work was essential to the functioning of the military medical system, yet it exposed them to sights and experiences that would remain with them for many years afterward. Only a minority of Indochinese infantry battalions saw sustained combat on the Western Front. The 7th and 21st Battalions were notable among those that participated in major engagements. These units fought at Verdun, along the Chemin des Dames, and in operations in Champagne, enduring the same shell fire, gas attacks, and grinding attrition as their French counterparts. Indo-Chinese battalions were also deployed to the Macedonian front, where they took part in campaigns around Monastir and Lake Ohrid in 1917. The majority of Indo-Chinese soldiers in France, however, performed non-combat tasks including guarding depots, handling supplies, and working in military factories far from the front lines. Recruitment of Vietnamese soldiers and workers was organized through the Colonial Labor Organization Service, which mobilized labor from colonies across the French Empire. Recruitment combined voluntary enlistment with varying degrees of pressure by local authorities, village chiefs, and colonial administrators. In some villages, quotas were established, and local notables faced pressure to produce the required number of recruits. Many came from rural districts where land scarcity and heavy taxation made military or labor service appear as a potential source of income and opportunity. The promise of wages and bonuses attracted men who saw few prospects at home in the rice fields of their native villages. Vietnamese workers in France were placed in a wide range of industries across the country. They labored in munitions plants, chemical factories, shipbuilding yards, and port facilities from Marseille to Paris. In some factories, Vietnamese workers made up a substantial proportion of the workforce. At gunpowder plants such as Le Repos, they reportedly constituted around 50% of workers by 1917. Indo-Chinese workers typically performed unskilled or semi-skilled jobs such as loading, machine feeding, trench digging, and transport tasks. The work was often dangerous, exposing them to toxic chemicals and industrial accidents, in addition to the ever-present risk of German bombardment in areas closer to the active front lines. Working and living conditions in wartime France were harsh and regimented. Vietnamese workers lived according to strict schedules, housed in barracks under surveillance by military or factory authorities. They were subject to military-style discipline and could face sanctions for desertion, insubordination, or breaches of factory rules. Pay for Vietnamese workers and soldiers was lower than that of metropolitan French counterparts, reflecting a racialized wage hierarchy that pervaded the wartime economy. Despite these inequalities, the wages earned in France still exceeded what most men could hope to earn laboring in the rice paddies of home. Remittances sent home by soldiers and workers provided additional income for some rural families in Vietnam during the war years. These funds helped households weather the pressures of taxation and subsistence, creating a financial link between the battlefields of France and the villages of Tonkin and Annam. The departure of tens of thousands of men reduced the male labor force in certain rural areas, though overall, Indochina remained distant from the main theaters of combat. Colonial authorities adjusted tax and labor demands to maintain rice and rubber production while also meeting recruitment quotas. Rice exports from Cochinchina continued during the war, supporting both local revenues and provisioning of the wider French Empire. Wartime shipping disruptions and military requisitions affected prices and availability of some commodities in Vietnamese markets. The French administration used the war to justify increased taxation and requisitions, presenting them as necessary contributions to imperial defense and the common struggle against Germany. Colonial propaganda campaigns urged Vietnamese to support the war effort, emphasizing loyalty to France and promises of future recognition when the conflict ended. Reformist figure Phan Cho Trinh publicly called on Vietnamese to support France during the war, hoping that loyal service would lead to political reforms and meaningful concessions. He and others believed that demonstrating patriotism might convince the French to treat their colonial subjects with greater respect and grant them expanded political rights when peace finally returned. Vietnamese service in France brought many recruits into direct contact with French society, cities, and political debates for the first time in their lives. In France, some Vietnamese soldiers and workers encountered socialist and anti-colonial ideas, including discussions within labor and political circles. They observed how French workers organized unions, how political debates unfolded in a metropolitan context, and how ideas about rights and equality were discussed openly in newspapers and public forums. The experience of shared hardship with French workers and soldiers contributed to changing perceptions about equality and colonial hierarchy. Men who had been told they were subjects began to think of themselves as people deserving of citizenship and recognition. After the war, Returning veterans and workers were often regarded in their home villages as individuals with broader horizons and new experiences. Many post-war Vietnamese labor leaders and activists emerged from the ranks of former World War I workers in France. The years they had spent in Europe had exposed them to new ways of thinking about politics, labor organization, and national identity. French postal censorship during and after the war recorded letters from Vietnamese veterans that mentioned emerging political figures and expressed critical views of colonial rule. The war opened migration channels that made it easier for some Vietnamese to remain in or return to France after 1918. Among those who used these pathways was a young man from Nguyen, who would later become known to the world as Ho Chi Minh. Nguyen Quoc, as he was then called, arrived in France during the war years and used the post-war context to engage with socialist and anti-imperialist networks that would shape his political development profoundly. The scale of Indo-Chinese participation in the war represented a significant colonial contribution to the conflict. Despite this contribution, wartime service did not lead to major political concessions for Vietnamese within the colonial system in the immediate post-war years. Some veterans and former workers, disappointed by the lack of reforms, later joined emerging nationalist and revolutionary organizations in the 1920s. Historians identify the wartime mobilization of Vietnamese soldiers and workers and their experiences in France as an important precondition for the growth of organized anti-colonial movements that would emerge in the years that followed. The Armistice of November 1918 marked the end of active wartime recruitment from Indochina and initiated the gradual repatriation of Vietnamese soldiers and workers from France. Demobilization began in late 1918 and continued through 1919 as Vietnamese men returned home in stages by ship to ports such as Marseille and then onward across the seas to Indochina. The process was slow and bureaucratic, as the machinery of empire that had sent them abroad now worked to return them to their villages and families who had waited years for their return. Returning veterans typically received bonuses, pensions, and, in some cases, small land grants or priority for public sector jobs, as promised in wartime recruitment announcements. French sources noted that discharged Vietnamese soldiers and workers were officially entitled to certain social advantages over compatriots who had not served, including hiring preferences for government positions. These benefits, though modest, marked the returnees as a distinct category within colonial society and set them apart from those who had remained at home throughout the conflict. Remittances from Vietnamese in France during the war had supported families at home, but these flows declined sharply after demobilization. The sudden loss of this income tightened household budgets in some villages that had come to depend on the wages their sons and husbands earned in distant factories. The end of wartime demand and shipping controls brought adjustments in export markets, affecting rice prices and trade in Cochinchina and Tonkin. Studies of Indochina's economy indicate that the immediate post-war period was marked by relative price volatility and considerable pressure on rural producers who depended on commodity markets for their livelihoods. Veterans returning to rural areas re-entered local economies marked by land concentration, heavy taxes, and limited opportunities outside agriculture. For some demobilized workers and soldiers, the gap between expectations of improved status and the realities of rural life became evident soon after their return. Letters monitored by French postal censors in 1919 showed Vietnamese veterans discussing both positive aspects of their French experience and disappointment with conditions at home. Wartime propaganda had raised hopes that loyal service would be rewarded with reforms and greater legal equality within the French Empire. The end of the war coincided with widespread discussion of principles of national self-determination articulated by figures such as United States President Woodrow Wilson. Vietnamese intellectuals and activists followed news of the Paris Peace Conference, seeing it as a potential opportunity to press for reforms and recognition of their aspirations. Perhaps, they thought, the world was entering a new era in which the rights of peoples everywhere would finally be acknowledged. Nguyen Au Quoc, born in Nghệ An in 1890, was by 1919 living in France and active in political circles there. During the war years and the immediate post-war period, he worked in Paris in modest jobs such as kitchen helper, while engaging with socialist and anti-colonial networks. The young man who would later become known to the world as Ho Chi Minh was finding his political voice in the ferment of post-war Europe. In June 1919, Nguyen Au Quoc drafted a petition commonly known as the List of Claims of the Vietnamese People and submitted it to the Paris Peace Conference. The petition was signed in the name of Nguyen Ai Quocs on behalf of the group of Annamite patriots, expressing demands on the French and Allied governments. The document represented one of the first formal attempts by Vietnamese activists to bring their cause before an international audience at a moment when the world seemed ready to listen. The claims of the Vietnamese people did not demand independence, but called for political and civil rights, legal reforms, and the end of special repressive tribunals. Specific points in the petition included amnesty for political prisoners, equality before the law, freedom of the press and association, and a Vietnamese representative elected to the French Parliament. The petition also requested educational reforms and the opening of technical and vocational schools for Vietnamese across the country. Nguyen Ai Quoc's text invoked the sacred right of nations to self-determination while presenting these demands as moderate reforms within the French system. The petition was distributed to delegations at Versailles and summarized in parts of the French and international press, though it received no official response from the conference. The great powers gathered in Paris had other concerns, and the aspirations of colonial peoples barely registered on their agenda amid the larger questions of European borders and reparations. French police began closely monitoring Nguyen Ai Quoc after the 1919 petition, identifying him as a rising figure among Vietnamese activists in France and Indochina. Postal censorship reports from 1919 indicated that Vietnamese veterans and workers in France were aware of his writings and discussed his ideas in letters home. His name began to circulate through networks that connected the diaspora in Europe with reformist and nationalist circles back in Vietnam. In Indochina, news of the Versailles Conference and Wilsonian rhetoric circulated through newspapers, returning workers, and elite discussion circles. Vietnamese reformist and constitutionalist groups in Cochin China renewed appeals for representation in colonial councils and the French Parliament after the war. Elected bodies such as the Colonial Council in Cochin China provided limited channels for local notables to express demands on taxation, education, and public works. Some Cochin China politicians, often referred to as constitutionalists, framed their petitions in terms of loyalty to France combined with calls for expanded civil rights. They hoped that the post-war moment might bring a new relationship between colonizer and colonized. Returning veterans and workers contributed to these debates by sharing observations about working conditions, political life, and social relations in France. Their accounts highlighted both technological advancement and examples of political participation that contrasted with colonial restrictions in Indochina. Economic pressures in 1918 and 1919 included rising prices for basic goods, partly linked to post-war global adjustments and local supply issues. Urban centers such as Saigon and Hanoi experienced fluctuations in wages and living costs, affecting workers and lower middle-class employees. Post-war fiscal policy maintained many colonial taxes and monopolies as authorities aimed to stabilize budgets and manage war-related debts. Under these conditions, small strikes and labor disputes began to appear, though large-scale organized labor movements would only develop in the early 1920s. Some early industrial and transport workers in 1918 and 1919 protested wages and working conditions in ports, mines, and railway workshops. Colonial authorities responded to these actions with a mix of negotiation, disciplinary measures, and strengthened policing of workplaces. In rural areas, veterans' land grants and pensions sometimes altered village social structures, adding a new category of state-linked smallholders. Nevertheless, many ex-servicemen and workers returned to communities still characterized by landlord dominance, communal obligations, and limited mobility. The contrast between promised rewards and persistent inequalities contributed to a sense of unfulfilled expectations among some returnees who had believed their service would be recognized. The combination of wartime service, exposure to European political ideas, and the Versailles moment intensified discussions among Vietnamese elites about constitutional reform and national rights. While overt revolutionary organizations had not yet emerged inside Vietnam by 1919, key individuals such as Nguyen, Ai Quoc, and earlier reformers were laying ideological and organizational groundwork abroad and at home. The seeds of future movements were being planted in the fertile soil of post-war discontent. The years 1918 and 1919 formed a transitional phase in which wartime experiences, post-war economic tensions, and new international discourses of rights converged to raise political expectations among segments of the Vietnamese population. Veterans who had seen France returned with new ideas about what was possible. Intellectuals who had read about Wilson's principles wondered why those ideals did not apply to them. The colonial system remained firmly in place, its structures of control and extraction largely unchanged by the war. Yet something had shifted beneath the surface. The experiences of the war years had created new networks, new knowledge, and new expectations that the old order could not easily contain. From the arrival of French warships at Touraine in 1858 to the frustrated hopes of 1919, the story of colonial Vietnam had traversed more than 6 decades of conquest, transformation, and resistance. What came next would build upon all that had come before.